You noble diggers, all stand up now.
Welcome, comrade. Never forget the forms.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to my channel. Today we will be talking about Plato's dialogue, the Meno. Yesterday I said that was something I had to reread because of the math. I feel embarrassed now, having reread it. I remember my professor talking about the hypotenuse. Maybe she was just making that up. Right? Either way, doesn't matter. We will be going through it. We'll jump around a little more. I'm going to start jumping through time through these speeches, right? Because we'll start to have to treat this as the debate of all history as it is, right? We have our starting point, which I hope you keep in mind and you hold closely, right? Which is that you know nothing, right? Know for certain, know 100% to be true, know nothing. These dialogues are ancient, right? And there's this proverb that keeps me humble and square when I'm reading these texts, right? Because there's a tendency among the academics to, try and read the truth from the text, right? Like try and really read what he was getting at. And you can't do that, right? This is not the language that he wrote in, right? And this is not the culture that he lived in. This is not the values that he lived for. It is the gulf of experience, right? In fact, that's what the quote says, right? The gulf between the terms horseplay and pony play are enough to tell you that maybe translation is more art than science, right? So just grain of salt, all the Greeks, right? But we're still early Plato here. We're still basically talking Socrates. Well, today we're moving into middle Plato. Meno is firmly middle Plato. But the first two we did, the Euthyphro and the Apology, that's early Plato. He's still, writing down what Socrates said. And instead, now he's into his 30s or maybe even his 40s, Plato. Right? And Socrates has been gone for almost 20 years, right? And the answers that Socrates gave are purposefully unsatisfactory, right? And so Plato's mind starts to grasp for more, right? What else can I know? How else can I know it? Right? And here we get Socrates starting to be turned into a sock puppet, right? And so let's get into it. This one starts like any other dialogue, right? We're going to be challenged about some kind of question about something, right? Some kind of term, right? Some kind of notion, some kind of ideal. And today it's virtue, right? You see, what is piety? What is virtue? It's basically a very similar question, yes? So Meno, and, going back to this translation and history thing, Meno ends up in history a part of a council of tyrants. I think they're called like the 12 tyrants or something like that. So if you knew at the time, right, or even in the Roman times following, you would know, right, who this Meno was and why him talking about justice and, governing well is funny, right? Because he ends up becoming a tyrant, right? A traitor to the people, an indulger in pleasure. So anyways, we're talking to Meno. Meno is a rich man. He's followed by his slaves in the market. Socrates is followed by his gaggle of autistics. And Meno goes, well, what is justice, right? And Socrates goes, I'd like to know too. Perhaps we could discuss. And they get into it. And so Socrates says, well, surely a good man like you should know. And he's like, I think I do know. He says, I think it is things like being just in your governance, right? Helping a friend, harming an enemy. And then he even goes on to say something that's weird, where he goes, even there are womanly virtues, right? Where they keep good account of the house, right? They keep a good economics in the traditional sense of the term, a house account, a house financial report. Economia, economica, whatever. It's a Greek word. But we've been here before, right? This is a formulaic argument that Plato does. If you end up reading more of them, there's like 30-ish. We're going to give a set of examples, right? We're going to give a definition that's too broad, and then a definition that's too broad, too narrow, and then circular. Aporia, no road, right? That's what know nothing. That's the conclusion of each early Platonic dialogue, is to be a no road, an aporia, which means we got nowhere, right? We didn't make anywhere on the piety question, right? As we're about to make nowhere on the virtue question. The point of showing that we don't know what these things are is to better orient yourself towards a quest towards truth, right? How can you even pursue truth if you can't know anything, right? It is an interesting question. So the first definition he gives after being rejected with his list of virtues, he says, well, virtue is obviously the desire for the beautiful and the power to attain it, right? And Socrates gets into it and he says, well, this first part seems redundant to me. Are there any who in their inner lives desire the bad, right? Everyone deems that they desire the good, and that what the good is can be misjudged greatly. That's bullshit, Socrates. Not everyone does that, but we'll run with that, right? We'll say that at least most people, an overwhelming amount of people, try and chase the good, right? So, no beauty. Scratch beauty from the definition, right? It is the power to attain good things, right? And instantly that breaks down, because that includes in your definition the right to be tyrannical, right? Like Meno ends up, right? Which is the implied joke of the whole thing, which is that that this guy who was, young and beautiful and from a well maintained family was easily corrupted by power, right? And turned into a tyrant. So it's a funny little quip in there. And then he says, as Socrates defeated that argument, Meno goes, well, then maybe it is power with justice, right? And justice was one of the virtues he referred to in his definitional set list, right? And so that's a circular argument. You can't say virtue is virtue, right? Virtue is virtue. Virtue is virtue. Brutal. Doesn't work, right? And so we move on, right? That's where a Platonic dialogue should end, right? But as I was saying, Plato's unhappy. Right? He doesn't like what Socrates has been saying to him in his own dialogues all this time, right? So he's decided to come up with his own theory, right? The theory of the forms, right? And thus we enter the great debate of all history, right? Is shit knowable or is it not, right? Are things ideal? Are they idealistic? Is there rationality? Or is there materialism? Is there bruteness? Is there nature? So Meno has a slave behind him, a slave boy, right? So doesn't read, doesn't write. Socrates calls him forward and draws a square in the sand in front of him. 2 feet by 2 feet, 4 square feet, right? And he asks the slave, how would you get 8 square feet in the, how would you do that, right? And the slave goes, well, I double it, right? 4 by 4, that's 16 square feet.
So Socrates draws a square on the ground and divides it into 4 smaller squares. Just by asking questions and without telling the slave the answers, the slave agrees that this square has an area of 4 and sides each with a length of 2. So Socrates then asks the slave, if we were to double the area of this square, i.e. if we had a square with an area of 8, what would the length of the sides be? The slave initially answers 4, but Socrates draws this 4x4 square on the ground, and the slave realises that if the sides are 4 in length, then the area will be 16 and not 8. So the slave realises that the length of the sides must be somewhere in between 2, the original square, and 4, the square with an area of 16. Eventually, Socrates draws a square like the original 2x2 square, but then draws diagonal lines across each of the 4 squares, dividing them into 8 triangles of equal size. If you look at this diagram, you could say there's a sort of smaller square in the middle of the bigger square that's composed of these 4 middle triangles. And this smaller square has an area of 4. If you look, it's made up of 4 triangles. Then if you look at the bigger square, you can see that it is composed of 8 triangles. It has an area of 8. So this is the point. The sides of the square with an area...
Socrates goes, no. And the slave thinks for a second and he goes, well, 3x3 then, right? And Socrates goes, no, that's 9 square feet. That doesn't work. And so what he does is he draws 3 extra boxes around the square, right? So there's a 2 feet by 2 feet square, and then there's 3 extra 2 feet by 2 feet squares, making a bigger square now, right? And then he draws a diagonal line through each of the boxes. And so you can use, simple math, deduction to find out the answer, right? And this is what he calls animasis, the remembering of things before you were born. Right? This is a very spiritual mysticism that we're getting into. You just got to play along. It's going to get more and more advanced as we go by, right? Plato is the first response to Socrates, but, until we get to someone like Kant, we're not really dealing with a very sophisticated response. Plato says that before you're born, there is a soul, right? And it has knowledge or contact with the forms of everything, right? Virtue, piety, knowledge, justice, right? These are ideals like angelic beings in the heavens that you would come into contact with. And then when you are put into an earthly container, you are able to remember them if you are asked the right questions, right? This is the first time that Plato breaks with Socrates, right? It's not really spelled out here. We're going to do the Republic next week in the cave, but it's already here. You can already see everything here, that he's unsatisfied with knowing nothing. He wants to be, at least in theory, able to know something, right? What is he pursuing if it is an actual absurdity, right? What is he doing if he is not accomplishing anything, if there's not even a point to try and accomplishing anything, right? Which is technically one of the conclusions you can draw from an aporia, from the no road, from the I know that I know nothing, right? But I feel that's a dispositional response, that you're depressed as a person, right? That you need certainty to act in the world, right? Man is not living in a world of certainty, right? He must act. I'm just going to point out here that Socrates in the Greek refers to truth as doxa aletha, right? And I'm kind of trepidatious to do this because he's not even in the course syllabus, but eventually Heidegger, who is a student of Husserl, who is in the course syllabus, uses this notion to develop a new notion of truth, right? And I feel like that is what I'm going to say is my notion of truth nearer to the end of the course. So I'll let you know here now. I really don't like hide the ball teaching, right? What's the point, right? You could find what I believe if you really worked hard at it. And so Heidegger says that it's like an aletheia, which means a revealing, right? He uses this example that all life is like walking through a thick wooded forest, right? There's shadows everywhere, you can't see anything. And that stumbling into a truth is like walking through a clearing where the sun beats down on you, where you can see everything, right? It's temporary though, and you're going to end back up in the shadows. I like that about truth, right? And so we're getting back into certainty. Just because you know that you know nothing doesn't mean that you don't believe other things. Yeah. Socrates knew that he knew nothing when he still went and fought as a soldier for his state. He knew that he knew nothing when he went and debated all the high and mighty and endangered himself. Knew that he knew nothing when he drank the hemlock poison that was ordered for him to do when he was commanded to be executed. Right? They executed him through suicidal poison. So what was the point of today's text? It's to introduce you to the shift to late Plato, right? You can read it if you read them all, that there's this slow shift that he becomes impatient, unhappy with what Socrates left him, and he starts to pervert what Socrates says, right? And eventually, by the end of it, by next week's text, the Republic, Socrates is gone. Right? There's nothing left of I know that I know nothing. Right? And so we'll do that next week. Have a nice day. Hello, you've made it to the end of the video. Thank you. This channel has one mission: to prevent civilizational collapse associated with climate change, to prevent 100 million refugees by 2035, to stop 7 billion from starving to death by 2075. And we will do this through one main vehicle. We mean to unite the Anglosphere. We will do this by convincing the Commonwealth of His Majesty King Charles III to apply for statehood as one. And then with this new power, we will be able to negotiate in good faith with the rest of the world on how to tackle this crisis. Thank you and enjoy.